but now we have to change because it's time for the next presentation. That Eva López Castillo, yeah, she's presenting a work in relation to the wood management and arboriculture practices in the site of IESSO. This is VILAUBA, the two Roman settlements in Northeast Iberian Peninsula.
I'm happy to be here today presenting and sharing with you my research. Thanks to the organization for this amazing event today and yesterday too, of course. So my presentation is wood management and arboriculture practices in the IESSO and VILAUBA settlements. I'm working with the University, the Autònoma in Barcelona team in the Archaeobotanical Laboratory. So the relationship between human and plants goes beyond the appearance of the agriculture. Since ancient times, plants have been part of alimentary, culture, and symbolic processes. Among the strategies developed by human societies to obtain plant resources, forest management and forestry have been some of the main practices. But some aspects related to wood management need to be defined because sometimes they can be confusing. So dendrology is the branch of botany specialized in the characterization and identification of wood plants, specifically their taxonomic classifications. Forestry and silviculture is the science and practice applied when it comes to restoring forests, manipulating their composition, structure, or growth to redirect the ecosystem towards a specific goal. Forestry constitutes the necessary key in the forest restoration. And finally, arboriculture is the branch of forestry sciences which practices the cultivation, care and management of trees and other wood species, especially in urban or peri-urban areas. So which were the wood management techniques in the Roman and late ancient world period? Basically, there were clear cutting, that it's considered one of the most basic systems that were applied in forestry practices, completely clearing a large forested area on an annual basis. The selection, this type of selection, of course, is practiced on wooded areas with trees of different age and diameter. Pruning or coppicing are a system would have been applied on the basis of the regenerative properties of various tree species. Pruning was practiced in Roman times as the classical...
Eva, are you changing the diapo because it's the slide? Because
okay, yes, yeah, that's okay. So pruning was practiced in Roman times as the classical sources testify, even since the Neolithic. And agroforestry, a widely spread practice in Roman times of the combination of the forestry practices mentioned together with areas of cultivation and areas of pasture. The classic reference of plants resources in the area of Catalonia and Balearic Island are from authors such as Pliny the Elder, Marco Portio Caton, Columella, or Theophrastus. The basic economic activity was agriculture based on three fundamental crops: cereals, vines, and olives, besides the fruit trees. Romanization was accompanied by an intense exploitation of plant resources, specifically forestry, that it had an important impact on extensive deforestation. What are the objectives of the research? First, identify the practices of forest management and arboriculture in the Roman and late ancient world based on the set of wood samples. Two, approach these practices based on archaeobotanical methods. Three, identify what would have been the main plant resources, mainly trees, shrubs, and fruit trees, for the sites under study as part of the subsistence resources. And finally, four, to continue the line of research already started on the identification of forest practices of anthropogenic origin on wood. About IESSO settlement, we can say that the Roman city of IESSO is located in the current town of Guissona, in Lleida, near to Cervera. The chronology of the site spans from the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD, even with chronology of later occupations. 2 wells have preserved organic materials in a humid environment, such as miscellaneous objects and remnants of shapeless wood in the form of branches and twigs. The 2 wells have been called Pou de la Muralla and Pou de les Termes, respectively. About VILAUBA settlements, we can say that VILAUBA allows the complete evolution of the Roman model of the villae to be followed in the same time. It is an extensive chronological period of occupation that spans from the 2nd, 3rd centuries BC to the 7th century AD, which materialized in a complex stratigraphic and structural superposition, 5,000 square meters. The methodology followed in the development of this study center of 3 main axes: taxonomic identification, morphological characterization, and determination of forest management. In order to deepen the study and interpretation of archaeological materials, an experimental program has also been designed through which a reference collection of current materials has been obtained. It was worked with a methodology already applied by other researchers for the study of forest management, analysis of the relationship between diameter and growth rings of the branches of wood. This model allows inferences to be made about whether the tree studied was managed anthropically or not. There were a large amount of archaeological material recovered from each of the wells in the form of thousands of fragments of branches, twigs, and other larger wood fragments, so it was obligated to sampling. The analyzed samples were selected and divided into groups from a macroscopic point of view. Over the current species, the branches study has been divided into a hierarchy of main and secondary branches. From each differentiated branch or branch segment, a wooden disc has been extracted that has been analyzed to identify the anatomical characteristic of the species, measure its diameter, radius, perimeter, and area, count and measure the number of growth rings. Due to the wide variability of diameters presented by the samples, 7 classification groups have been created with different ranges of diameters. Of the 487 remains studied, a total of 486 have been identified to some degree. The identified remains have different degrees of specificity. 1 remain has been identified as an indeterminate conifer, 38 remains have been identified up to family level, all the Leguminosae, all the Rosaceae Malloidae, and 2 Salicaceae, and the rest of the analyzed samples could be identified to the species level, with the exception of 1 Buxus sempervirens, 3 samples of Olea europaea and Vitis vinifera, whose identification has not been conclusive. Of the 6 species selected for the reference collection, the apricot tree, the plum tree, the peach tree, and the cherry tree have been cultivated and also managed. The wild almond tree has neither been cultivated nor managed, and the elder has been cultivated but not managed. 144 samples have been studied of the reference collection. The type of vegetation that have been identified are deciduous forest, riparian forest, Mediterranean forest, conifers, possible cultivated species, and small groups of undeterminate ones. The types of vegetation most clearly identified in both sites are the riparian forest and arable species. The riparian forest accounts for about 34% of the total of the samples from the 2 sites, which are mostly represented by Salix sp and Sambucus nigra. cultivable species represent almost 42% of the total. Prunus sp stand out very clearly, given the high representation in IESSO compared to VILAUBA. On the other hand, the taxa Olea Europea and Vitis sp are clearly represented in VILAUBA, while IESSO they have much lower percentages. The dominant species in this study group, a minimum number of 50, are the prunus, the elder, and the willow. The prunus stand out in IESSO with a big difference compared to VILAUBA. The elder is present exclusively in IESSO but relatively high numbers, while the willow has a majority presence in IESSO, but also in VILAUBA. In addition to the three previous data, taxa of other species has also been identified, as can be seen in the graphic. In order to carry out the edge diameter analysis over the archaeological remains, a previous selection has been made, eliminating the samples that have an undeterminable number of rings or diameter due to a poor state of preservation. Finally, the set on which the analyzed is based contains 367 samples if we compare with the preceding data. The scatterplot relates all types of archaeological prunus, experimental managed and experimental unmanaged. The trend of each one repeats model 1 and 2 of round method. The archaeological prunus set offer an horizontal pattern according to model 2, just like the experimental managed prunus sp, while will and unmanaged prunus dulcis maintains a more vertical line shape according to model 1. For this study in Salix sp, the reference collection of managed and unmanaged willows from Denmark and Netherlands was kindly provided by Drs. Oud, Hanninen and Vermeeren. Despite climatic and sample differences, the tendency of archaeological salix in IESSO and VILAUBA shows a horizontal distribution pattern similar to the managed salix of North of Europe. Choose everything will make us think about the management practice on this species in our study context. Here we have the relationship between both types of Sambucus nigra, archaeological and experimental ones. Two trends can be observed in this graph. For the archaeological, the represented pattern has an horizontal tendency, while for the experimental, the represented pattern has a linear tendency. Choose the distribution of archaeological samples will have characteristics of forest management, while the experimental one doesn't present this characteristic, a fact because the experimental elder had been planted but not managed. The discussion. A relevant aspect of the set for both sides is the majority presence of branches and twigs in the three wells. Here you can see that most of the study branches are in the smallest ranges between 0 and 15 millimeters, which translate into 87% of the total, implying great difficulty in their taxonomy identification. The abundance of branch remains is already offering important information that allow us to hypothesize that the remains studied have been the product of different practices related to forest management and arboriculture, rather than constructive or manufacturing aspects. In this graphic, we can say that most of the identified taxas have known uses for various manufacturing activities, construction, food, oils, and dyes, among others. In both settlements, the variety of species producing some food resources is quite remarkable. This documented allusion to sweet fruits such as cherry and plum is a very relevant fact. Other species represented in the study, such as the group of species producing nuts, almonds, hazelnuts, or walnuts, and producing wild fruits such as dogwoods, elderberries, or blackberries, represent an important group of food resources. The taxon Prunus sp is the most represented by a wide margin, Therefore, it can be inferred that arboriculture practice on this species was a common occurrence. Another species to keep in mind is the consumption of figs. It was a fruit that, due to its ways of preservation through drying, provide a value fruit resources. The results obtained from this analysis allow us to state that the three analyzed taxa, Prunus, Salix, and Sambucus nigra, present similar characteristics to the species that have been managed by pruning the branches, a fact that would confirm that this was a common practice in both IESSO and VILAUBA settlements. The purpose of this pruning could have been to obtain fruit in the case of the prunus and the elder, or to obtain wood with certain morphometric properties in the case of the willow. It should also be mentioned that among the samples from the VILAUBA well, it was possible to recover fragments of branches with clear evidence of pruning. These are Vitis vinifera branches with cut marks which correspond to the removal of secondary branches and regrowth of wood around them, which would indicate that the branch continued to grow after pruning. It can therefore be stated that pruning practices were also carried out in this species. The conclusions we have is that fruit species predominate in both sets, both sweet and dried fruits. The abundance of branches raises the question of the possible management of documented trees and shrubs through pruning practices. The main fruit tree taxon managed at the IESSO site was Prunus sp, while in VILAUBA, it has been possible to see that the taxonomic distribution is more dispersed, without any taxon or type of vegetation standing out in particular. The reason for this taxonomic dispersion will have to do with the typology of rural settlement that is represented in the VILAUBA site, which perhaps allowed the exploitation of a broader set of species based on agricultural customs at the time. The 8 diameter method applied has been made it possible to detect arboricultural practices in 3 species, Prunus sp, Salix sp, and Sambucus nigra. And finally, the direct evidence of pruning observed in some branches confirms that Vitis vinifera was also subject to these practices. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Eva. Is there any question to the presentation? Well, as I co-author, I only have to say that is the application of the year diameter analysis is a very interesting approach. And for solve some of the questions that we talk about at the beginning of the session, how to identify the wood management. So the thing is very interesting to work in this direction for provide some answer at this question. And there is a question in the chat. It's about why the wood is in the well. It's a question of Gretel Boswick. So Eva, you have an answer for this?
Yes, well, when we studied the samples in these 2 settlements, the wells were progressively filling the contents with the branches like a trash. It's a trash, and the city was disappearing by time, and the trash was the well specifically. And one of the wells was completely full very quickly, but the other one was progressively filling the contents with other archaeological remains, such as bones or other pieces, big pieces of wood, worked wood in this case. Thank you.